Mrs. Janet Crawford lunged toward Piper Blackwell's desk. Her eyes narrowed like blades, and her fingers were already poised to seize the denim jacket on the child's shoulders. Her mouth ground out each word as she snarled that Piper was to take that filthy thing off immediately. A jacket that smelled like the slums had no place in her classroom. Before Piper could even lift her hands to protect it, the teacher had already grabbed the collar and yanked. The stitching her mother had repaired 3 times with cracked hands tore apart in front of 30 children, frozen in fear. Then, Crawford flung the jacket into the trash as if it were nothing more than a garbage bag. She turned back with a victorious glare and roared that if Piper's parents could not afford decent clothes, then they should not bring trash into her classroom, asking whether Piper wanted the whole class to smell her family's poverty. Piper stood up, terrifyingly calm. She walked to the trash can, lifted the jacket out, folded it neatly, and placed it in her backpack. Looking straight at Crawford, she said only that the teacher had no right to touch her belongings. Then, Crawford's hand swung. The sound of the slap cracked through the dead silence of the classroom as the left cheek of the 10-year-old burned red. Yet, Crawford still did not stop. She marched back to her desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a pair of scissors. The steel blades flashed under the fluorescent light. She stormed back, ripped the jacket from Piper's bag, and cut a long slash from shoulder to hem. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the room like breaking bone. The careful seams Elise Dawson, Piper's mother, had stitched over many nights under dim light inside an old Honda Civic during a Tennessee winter, using blue thread because she had none to match, now lay motionless on the classroom floor like a piece of memory severed. The $3 jacket from Goodwill that a single mother once wrapped around her daughter every night when they had no home, no bed, nothing but each other, now lying in 2 pieces at the feet of a 48-year-old woman who smiled as she declared that now it truly was trash. And the entire class gaped, Wyatt Chen's hands shaking as he kept recording on his phone hidden beneath the desk. Zoe Martinez standing to protest only to be shouted down at once. Yet Piper did not scream, did not cry, did not tremble. She simply bent down, picked up both pieces of the jacket, folded them carefully as if they were still whole, and placed them back into her backpack. Her jaw clenched, her eyes dry, her breathing steady, because 10 years of life, from 4 months sleeping in a car, to days when her mother skipped meals so her child could eat, from learning at 5 years old to master the art of silence so she wouldn't add to the invisible burdens her mother carried, had taught her one thing most 10-year-olds should never have to learn. Never let them see you break. But what Crawford did not see, what she had never bothered to understand, was the small hand beneath the desk, pressing a button on a nondescript black band that resembled a cheap, plastic toy watch. A custom-engineered device hidden beneath her sleeve, triggering a pre-programmed silent alarm that connected directly to a man whose love for his daughter was matched only by his capacity for calculated destruction. A man who grew up orphaned in South Boston and swore no one would ever touch his family. And when the watch vibrated softly with a single line that read, "Do not be afraid, your dad is coming," the carefully constructed world Janet Crawford had built over 14 years of teaching began counting down to collapse because she had just raised her hand in scissors against the most sacred keepsake of the Kieran Blackwell family, a man whose true nature most of this city never suspected. A reclusive titan who commanded a legitimate empire while his real power remained hidden in the shadows, and he had never, not once, forgiven anyone who dared harm his family. If this story made you curious, please tap like to support the channel, share this video with anyone who needs to hear this story, and do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next will make it impossible to look away. The medical room at Pemberton Academy smelled of antiseptic, and cold white lights shone straight down onto the small chair where Piper Blackwell sat alone, her feet not touching the floor, her back straight, her eyes facing forward yet seeing nothing, the 2 pieces of the denim jacket resting in her lap, folded neatly and aligned as if she were trying to piece together something that had been broken. The blue stitching her mother had sewn 3 times with weathered, hard-working hands now exposed along the cut, the thread still intact, while the fabric itself had been torn apart, and anyone who looked closely would notice her fingers gripping the edge of the cloth so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the only sign that something inside her was fracturing, because Piper Blackwell's face did not change at all, still calm, still controlled, still the face of a child who learned how to hide pain before she learned how to write her own name. The slap mark on her left cheek began to swell, shifting from red to a pale purple along the lower edge, and the school nurse placed a cold pack on the table beside Piper. But the girl did not touch it. She simply sat there, holding the 2 pieces of the jacket, and waited. What the medical room did not know, what the entire school did not know, was that Janet Crawford's hostility toward Piper Blackwell had not begun this morning. It began on the first day of the school year, with the first look Crawford gave the child when she flipped through the parent file and saw the line that read Mother's Occupation Server. From the opening parent meeting when Elise Dawson walked into the room wearing a simple blouse and shoes worn thin at the heels, politely smiling at Crawford. And Crawford looked her up and down before turning to a colleague and whispering loudly enough for Elise to hear that it was definitely a scholarship case. From that moment, Crawford built a small and vicious system aimed at Piper. She secretly lowered Piper's test scores, even though the girl consistently ranked at the top of the class. She ignored Piper's raised hand while calling immediately on any wealthy child who merely cleared their throat. Furthermore, she placed Piper in a group labeled as needing additional support, even though the girl outperformed every student on the elite list. She made pointed remarks in front of the class that only Piper understood were meant for her. Lines like some families should not try to squeeze into places they do not belong, or not everyone is born to sit here. Some people should only be pouring water and serving. Piper never told her parents about those words. She carefully masked the bullying, hiding the bruises beneath her sleeves because she knew the darkness her father was capable of, and she wanted to protect his soul from returning to that world for her sake. She swallowed them the same way she swallowed hunger at 6 so her mother could eat, the same way she had learned to carry the heavy weight of their shared struggle without ever letting it show. Piper Blackwell was 10 years old, and her resilience was forged in a fire that most adults in this world would never survive. The door to the medical room opened. Ms. Orozco, the school counselor, 35 years old, stepped inside with a face drained of color from what she had just heard from students. She sat beside Piper, placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, and asked if she wanted to talk, but Piper only shook her head slightly, her gaze still fixed forward, her arm still holding the jacket, and said a single sentence in a voice so calm it sent a chill down Miss Orozco's spine. "My dad is coming." The watch on Piper's wrist showed 4 minutes since the message was sent. It had been 4 minutes since the encrypted alert a code-red threat flashed on the phone of a man sitting in a meeting room on the 38th floor. In those 4 minutes, 6 people exited the room within 11 seconds of seeing the man's expression change. 3 calls were made to the 3 most dangerous men in the organization. A black car rolled out of the parking garage beneath Blackwell Enterprises, heading straight for Pemberton Academy. But the order had been given before the wheels ever touched the street, because Kieran Blackwell did not need time to decide when someone touched his daughter. That decision had been made the day he knelt to eye level with an 8-year-old girl in the staff room of a bar and said 2 words, "I promise." And Kieran Blackwell was a man who never broke his word. To understand why Piper Blackwell did not cry when she was slapped in front of 30 children, why she picked up the 2 pieces of the jacket with steady hands and folded them neatly, as if it were just another ordinary day, you need to know how she grew up. And to know that, you need to know the woman who gave birth to her. The woman who sewed that jacket 3 times with weathered, hard-working hands. The woman Janet Crawford looked up and down at the parent meeting and whispered, "Definitely a scholarship case," about without ever bothering to learn who she was or what it took for her to stand there. Elise Dawson grew up in a dusty small town outside Memphis, Tennessee, where summers were hot enough to melt asphalt and winters were cold enough to freeze water in the pipes, in a 1-story wooden house whose paint had peeled long before she was born. And Elise's first memory wasn't a lullaby or the smell of baking bread, but the sound of a bottle shattering against the kitchen wall at 2 a.m, her father's voice growling words no one should hear, and her mother crying very softly behind a locked bedroom door. Elise's mother was named Ruth, a thin woman with eyes that were always cast downward and shoulders that were always drawn tight, and she stayed in that house for 6 years, enduring a husband who turned every bottle of whiskey into a storm, until one March morning, when Elise was 6 years old and woke to find her mother's bed empty, her closet empty, her vanity empty. No note, no explanation, no final hug. Ruth vanished from her daughter's life as if she had never existed, and 6-year-old Elise stood in that empty room for a long time, not crying, not calling out, just staring at the bare hook on the wall and understanding something no child that age should ever have to understand, that you can love someone and they can still leave, that blood doesn't mean staying. Elise's father, a large man named Gerald, never looked for his wife. He just drank more. And when he was drunk, he beat Elise for any reason at all. for cold food, for an unlocked door, for looking like her mother, for looking at him with Ruth's eyes. And when he was sober, he forgot Elise existed, sitting in front of the television with a beer from morning to night, while Elise became a ghost in her own home, learning how to move without making noise, learning how to cook at 7, learning how to wash bruises with cold water and hide them under long sleeves, growing up by learning how to be invisible, because in that house, being seen meant being hurt. At 16, after a night when Gerald was so drunk he hurled a wooden chair at the wall less than a hand's width from Elise's head, she decided she would rather die on the street than die in that house. She stuffed $30 in tips from her grocery store job into the pocket of her jeans, left everything behind, and walked out the door at 4 a.m. while Gerald snored on the sofa. She didn't look back, didn't cry, carried nothing but $30 and a single lesson, that she couldn't rely on anyone, that if she wanted to live, she had to save herself. The next 2 years were 2 years of sleeping in shelters, on park benches, in break rooms behind diners where she washed dishes 14 hours a day for wages that couldn't even cover a rented room. She did everything: waiting tables, cleaning hotel rooms, folding laundry at a laundromat, and she complained to no one, because there was no one to complain to, until she was 18 and met Brandon. Brandon had a wide smile and warm eyes. He worked as a mechanic in a small garage. He told Elise she was beautiful, that she deserved to be loved, that he wasn't going anywhere. And Elise, an 18-year-old girl who had never heard those words before, believed him. She believed with her entire abandoned heart, believed so deeply that when the pregnancy test showed 2 lines, she wasn't afraid, but smiled, because she thought she was finally going to have a real family. But the world taught Elise Dawson a lesson it had already taught her at 6, and that she kept trying to forget. That people can say they love you and still leave, because exactly 3 days after Elise told Brandon she was pregnant, his number was disconnected. The room he rented was empty. The garage where he worked said he'd quit the day before without explanation. And Elise stood in front of that empty room at 18, her belly just beginning to show. Alone, broke, homeless, with no one, just like the morning she was 6, standing before her mother's empty closet. Except this time, she wasn't a child anymore, and there was another child inside her, a child she swore she would never abandon, never, even if it killed her. Elise Dawson gave birth at 21, alone, in the Shelby County Public Hospital on a November night when rain lashed the windows as if the sky itself were angry, with no one holding her hand in the delivery room, no one waiting in the hallway, no flowers, no smiles, only the steady beeping of monitors and cold fluorescent lights pouring down onto the face of a 21-year-old woman biting into a hospital towel to keep from screaming because she didn't want the nurses to worry, didn't want to bother anyone, something she'd learned not to do since she was 6 when her mother left, and her father only noticed her when he needed something to pour his rage into. When Piper's first cry cut through the room, Elise looked down at the wrinkled red face on her chest and cried for the first time in her life, not from pain and not from fear, but because she saw something she'd never had, someone who wouldn't leave her, someone who needed her, and she whispered into the ear of the wailing baby that she would never leave her. Never did she hear her. She would never do what her own mother had done. The $12,000 hospital bill arrived the following week. Elise shoved it to the bottom of her bag, knowing it would take 7 years to pay off, and she didn't care because the baby in her arms was healthy, and that was the only thing that mattered. The world didn't give Elise time to breathe, because 3 months after Piper was born, the landlord knocked at 7 a.m. with an eviction notice for 2 months of unpaid rent, and Elise stood in the parking lot, looking down at the old Honda Civic she'd bought for $700, saved over 2 years of washing dishes, the car whose right door only opened if you kicked it, and whose heater worked only when it felt like it. Then she looked at Piper asleep in the car seat in her arms, and understood that starting that night, the car would be their home. For 4 full months, in the middle of a Tennessee winter, Elise Dawson and Piper Dawson lived in that Honda Civic, parked at the far edge of a Walmart lot, because it was the only place with lights on all night and security that didn't chase them away, with temperatures dropping below freezing on some nights, and breath fogging the windows. Elise wrapped every thin blanket and piece of clothing she owned around Piper, and held her daughter tight against her chest, using her own body heat as a furnace for a 3-month-old baby, shaking all night, but never letting go, and never letting Piper get cold. During the day, Elise worked 3 jobs, bartending from 6 in the evening to 2 in the morning, cleaning houses for 2 families from 8 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, and delivering flowers on weekends, sleeping 3 hours a night, sometimes 2, sometimes none at all, eating leftover bar food, because every dollar went to Piper's formula and diapers, with days when she drank only water and coffee from morning to night. Yet when she returned to the car and saw Piper sleeping peacefully in her seat, she smiled, because the baby was fed, and that was enough. Then one rainy January afternoon, when Elise stopped by a Goodwill thrift store looking for something warm for Piper, she saw it. An oversized adult denim jacket hanging at the very back of the women's rack, the blue faded, the collar worn, one button missing, priced at $3, and Elise lifted it, felt the thickness of the fabric, thought it would be warm enough to wrap around Piper on nights when the heater failed, paid the $3, carried it back to the car, and that night, under the glow of a streetlight through the windshield, she took out needle and thread and sewed the missing button back on with blue thread because she didn't have a matching color, then patched the torn right pocket with a piece cut from her own old jeans. Each pushed through the thick fabric, pricking her fingers until they bled, but she didn't stop, stitching until the jacket was whole, then wrapping it around Piper, holding her daughter close, and softly singing a song she made up because she couldn't remember her own mother ever singing to her, her teeth chattering from the cold, but her voice steady because the baby in her arms needed to hear that everything would be okay. Even as snow fell outside the windows, and inside the car, there were only the two of them and a $3 denim jacket. From that night on, the jacket became more than a jacket. It was the blanket around Piper when the cold set in, the stand-in for her mother's arms when Elise had to leave the car for a night shift and entrust Piper to a kind neighbor in the cheap apartments near the lot. The first familiar scent Piper knew, denim mixed with her mother's cheap shampoo, a faint trace of sweat after 14-hour shifts, the smell of survival, and it was the quiet promise Elise repeated every night as she wrapped it around her daughter that she would never leave her, she would never be Ruth, she would be here always, always. And that $3 Goodwill denim jacket, with mismatched blue stitching and a patch cut from torn jeans, became the most valuable thing Elise Dawson owned, not for its price, but because it carried 4 winter months when mother and daughter had nothing but each other. 4 months in which Elise proved her promise wasn't empty words. And years later, when Piper grew up, she still wore that same jacket every day, its once massive sleeves now fitting her growing frame as a stylish, oversized coat, because no jacket in the world, no matter how expensive, could replace the memory of winter nights in an old Honda Civic, when her mother held her close and sang to her, even as her teeth chattered from the cold. Piper Dawson grew up faster than any child ever should, not because she wanted to, but because life left her no other choice, and the lessons she taught herself in silence are ones no school in the world could ever teach. At 5, Piper could already tell the difference between her mother's footsteps when Elise was happy and when she was sad. Happy steps light and quick, sad ones, slow and heavy, as if each step carried something invisible but crushing. And on nights when Elise came home from a 14-hour shift with that second kind of walk, Piper lay on the small bed in the cramped rented room they finally managed to afford after 4 months living in the car, turned her face to the wall, closed her eyes, slowed her breathing, and pretended to sleep, because she knew that after checking whether her daughter was asleep, Elise would go into the bathroom, turn the water on full, and cry. Cry for the stack of bills on the kitchen table, cry for hands cracked raw by cleaning chemicals, cry for a kind of exhaustion she wasn't allowed to show in front of her child. And 5-year-old Piper lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to each muffled sob slipping through the sound of running water. And she didn't climb out of bed, didn't knock on the bathroom door, didn't ask if her mother was okay, because she understood, with the instinct of a child who'd seen too much, that her mother needed those minutes, needed to cry without worrying about being seen, needed to be weak for 5 minutes before returning as the strongest person in Piper's world. So she pretended to sleep night after night, keeping that secret to herself as the smallest gift she could give her mother. At 6, Piper began eating less, not because she lacked appetite, but because she noticed that at every dinner, Elise always scooped the larger portion into her daughter's bowl and kept the smaller one for herself. Some nights, Elise's share was just leftover vegetables and a few grains of rice scraped from the bottom of the pot. So Piper started saying she was full after finishing only half her bowl and pushed the rest toward her mother. And Elise looked at her suspiciously, but Piper smiled easily and said she'd eaten an afternoon snack at school and wasn't very hungry, even though her stomach was still aching, even though the free school snack was just a small carton of milk and 2 crackers that Piper split in half, eating only one and slipping the other into her backpack in case her mother had nothing to eat that night. At 7, when Elise finally saved enough for a deposit on a slightly better room with a window looking out onto the alley instead of a brick wall, she apologized to Piper for how small it was, for there being no separate room, for it not looking like the nice houses her classmates lived in. And Piper looked at her mother with the clear eyes of a 7-year-old who'd lived far beyond her age and said they didn't need a big house, they just needed each other. And Elise turned away quickly, but not fast enough for Piper to miss the tears. And this time Piper didn't pretend not to see. She ran to wrap her arms around her mother's waist, pressed her face to Elise's stomach, and they stood there for a long time in the empty room that held only a single bed, a plastic table, and the denim jacket hanging on the door hook, holding each other in silence. The bond between Elise and Piper wasn't like any ordinary mother and daughter relationship. It was deeper and tighter because they'd survived things most families never face. They were teammates before they were parent and child, survivors together before they were a family. Elise never spoke badly of Brandon in front of Piper, and when Piper asked about her father, Elise simply said he wasn't ready, but her mother was always here. No bitterness, no resentment, just the truth, and Piper accepted it the way she accepted everything else in her life, quietly and with eyes that didn't flinch. Piper inherited that extraordinary endurance from Elise, the ability to swallow tears, the ability to stand upright when the world wanted her on her knees, the ability to turn her face into a calm mask even as something inside shattered. But beneath all that armor, beneath the strength life forced her to wear far too early, Piper Dawson was still a child, still needed to be held, still needed to hear she was safe, still sometimes climbed into her mother's bed in the middle of the night, not out of fear but because she missed the smell of that denim jacket, the scent of nights in the car when the whole world was just the two of them, and she needed to be reminded that even now, with a bed, a roof, and enough food, her mother was still here, hadn't left, and was still keeping her promise. 3 more years passed, and Elise Dawson, now 28, was still working the night shift as a bartender on a street people avoided even in daylight, and where after dark only those with nowhere else to go appeared, earning $2,800 a month before tips, enough to pay for a small room, enough to keep Piper fed and in school. But never enough to stop Elise from worrying, never enough for her to sleep through the night without jolting awake at 3 in the morning thinking about utility bills or health insurance she didn't have, while 7-year-old Piper spent every night at home with Mrs. Helen, a 72-year-old neighbor who lived alone in the next unit, the only person in the world Elise trusted with her daughter. Mrs. Helen never took money for babysitting. She only said, "Go to work. I'll watch her. She's a good girl, just like her mother." That night was the 2nd night of October, 1:47 in the morning. Elise carried 2 black trash bags out into the alley behind the bar like she did every shift. The alley so dark she had to use her phone light to avoid stepping into puddles. The smell of damp garbage mixed with urine and wet concrete. She tossed the bags into the dumpster and turned back when her foot stepped into something warm and wet. She shone her phone down and saw blood, a long smear leading from the mouth of the alley to the corner wall where a man was slumped against brick, his head tilted to one side, an expensive gray suit soaked in blood from his left shoulder down to his hip, his face so pale his lips were nearly white, his right hand clutching a phone but shaking too hard to work the screen. Elise's survival instinct screamed in her head to walk away. Her world had never been kind, and a man shot in a dark alley at 2 in the morning was not her problem. But then, Elise looked into his eyes. In those eyes, already blurring from blood loss, she saw a reflection of her own past. She saw the desperation of someone with no one left to call. Elise Dawson could not walk away. Having been abandoned herself, she refused to do that to anyone else. She dragged the man into the staff break room behind the bar. He weighed twice as much as she did, but she pulled with every ounce of strength left after a 10-hour shift, laid him down on a torn old sofa, ripped open his shirt and saw the wound, a bullet lodged in his left shoulder, blood still flowing but slower. And Elise didn't panic, because she'd lived a life where panic was a luxury she was never allowed. She grabbed a bottle of cheap vodka from behind the bar, poured it over the small knife she used to cut lemons, poured it over the wound. The man clenched his teeth and groaned but didn't scream. And Elise used that knife, with the same hands that had sewn a denim jacket under a streetlight inside a car, the same hands that had stitched her own arm with a sewing needle because she couldn't afford a hospital, to remove the bullet, slowly and precisely, while her other hand pressed a towel into the wound to stop the bleeding. The man, half conscious, grabbed her wrist, his voice hoarse, but each word clear, asking if she knew who he was. And Elise, her hand still pressing the towel, her eyes fixed on the wound, answered without looking up that she didn't and didn't care, that he was bleeding and needed to stay still. He looked at her, and even as he lost blood, even as pain drenched him in cold sweat, he was clear enough to recognize that the woman in front of him wasn't afraid, wasn't shaking, wasn't asking unnecessary questions. She was simply doing what needed to be done with the calm of someone used to facing situations others ran from. He told her to call a number. She did. And after listening, the man on the other end went silent for 3 seconds before saying to keep him alive and that he would be there in 20 minutes. And Elise sat beside that man for 20 minutes, holding the towel in place, not asking who he was, not asking who shot him, not asking why, just sitting there, keeping him alive, with cracked hands and the endless patience life had carved into her bones. 20 minutes later, the back door of the bar opened. A tall man of 38 with sharp eyes stepped in with 2 others, Finn, his longtime second in command. And when he saw the man on the sofa still breathing, he looked at Elise with an expression she couldn't tell was gratitude, or assessment, or both. They lifted the wounded man and took him out, and before getting into the car, he turned back to look at Elise, blood still seeping through the temporary bandage, his face still pale, but his eyes completely clear, and he told her that he owed her his life, and that he was a man who didn't forget debts. Elise said nothing. She stood at the back door watching the black car disappear into the darkness, then turned back to the staff room, wiped the blood from the sofa, washed the towels, took out the trash a second time, changed into a clean apron, and stepped back behind the bar to keep serving customers as if the last 20 minutes had never happened, because Elise Dawson didn't have time to stop. She had a shift to finish, and a daughter sleeping at Mrs. Helen's, and she needed tonight's tips to pay for Piper's milk next week. And the man she had just saved in a dark alley, the man whose name she didn't know, whose face she hadn't seen without blood, the man who said he didn't forget debts in the voice of someone used to giving orders, rather than saying thank you. That man's name was Kieran Blackwell. 3 days after that night, when Elise opened the door of the small rented room at 6 a.m. to leave for her first house-cleaning shift of the day, her foot struck a thick envelope lying right at the threshold, a plain white envelope with no name and no return address. She picked it up, opened it, and nearly dropped it when she saw stacks of neatly arranged cash inside. $50,000. More than everything Elise had earned over the past 3 years combined, along with a white business card that carried no name and no logo, only a 10-digit phone number printed in black ink on heavy paper, finer than anything Elise had ever touched. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the envelope of money in her hands, then looking at Piper asleep on the bed inside the room, her small hand still gripping the corner of the denim jacket as she did every night. And Elise thought about everything $50,000 could buy, thought about paying off the hospital debt, thought about Piper having her own room, having health insurance, having a new pair of shoes instead of the ones with worn soles she had never complained about. But then she folded the envelope, slid it to the bottom of the desk drawer beneath unpaid bills, and spent not a single dollar. That night, after finishing her bar shift at 2 a.m, Elise took out the card and called the number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. The line on the other end silent, no one speaking first. And Elise said in a calm voice, each word clear, that she was the woman from the alley behind the bar the other night, that she had received his envelope, and that she was calling to say she did not need the money, that she did not sell gratitude, that she helped him because he was bleeding, not because she wanted $50,000. Silence on the line, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Then a man's voice, low and slow, the voice of someone accustomed to listening more than speaking, asked what she needed, and Elise, the woman who had refused $50,000 in cash without hesitation, said that her daughter had pneumonia last winter, that she had taken her to the public hospital and was still paying the bill, that she had no health insurance for her, and that if he truly wanted to repay the debt, then her daughter needed health insurance, nothing more. The next morning, when Elise opened the door, a smaller envelope lay at the threshold. Inside it a health insurance card, the highest tier available, the name on the card Piper Dawson, and Elise stood there for a long time staring at it, her fingers tracing each letter of her daughter's name. before placing it into her wallet more carefully than anything she had ever kept except the denim jacket hanging on the door hook. The man on the other end of the line, the man who had sent $50,000 and received a refusal, the man who had listened to a bartender refuse 3 years of her wages just to ask for health insurance for her child, lay in the penthouse at the top of a building he owned outright, staring at the ceiling in the dark. And for the first time in many years, he thought about his own past. Kieran Blackwell grew up in South Boston, in a cramped third-floor apartment in a housing block for Irish immigrants. His father, Patrick, a decent man with calloused hands, who worked 14-hour days at a shipyard for wages that kept the family from starving, but never allowed them to live with dignity. His mother, Moira, an Irish woman with red hair and a smile. Kieran remembered, despite years spent trying to forget it. She suffered from lupus, an autoimmune disease that consumed the body from the inside, and because the family had no health insurance, she never received proper treatment, only cheap painkillers and prayers, until prayers were no longer enough, and Moira Blackwell died in a public hospital bed when Kieran was 12, the boy holding his mother's hand as it grew colder minute by minute before going still. The last thing she told her son being not to be angry at the world, because it was not worth it. Patrick did not drink after his wife died. He was not violent, and he did not abandon his son. He simply broke in the quietest way possible, working more, 16 hours, 18 hours, 20 hours, as if stopping would force him to face the empty bed beside him and the lingering smell of pain medication on his wife's pillow. And 3 years later, Patrick Blackwell died in his sleep. His heart stopped, just like that, exhaustion. His body had given everything it had, and there was nothing left to keep him alive. Kieran, 15 years old, stood in the cemetery wearing a borrowed suit far too large for his thin frame, rain falling onto 2 fresh graves. No relatives present because his parents had left Ireland with hope and brought no one with them. No friends because Kieran had none. No money because Patrick had spent the last of it on the previous month's rent. And the 15-year-old boy stood there in the rain, alone, completely alone, looking down at the 2 graves and understanding that from that moment on, he had no one in the world, no one to cook for him, no one to leave a light on for him, no one to say do not be angry at the world. That night, Kieran slept under a bridge because the apartment had been locked for unpaid rent. The following week, he began running errands for a local gang, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only road left open to a 15-year-old with no one, nothing, and no future. And Kieran climbed not with his fists, but with his mind, with the ability to read people, read situations, see 2 moves ahead where no one else looked. By 25, he had his own empire. By 30, he bought a legitimate front with real estate, restaurants, and investments. But inside, Kieran Blackwell was always the 15-year-old boy standing in the rain at a cemetery. And that boy had sworn that if he ever had a family, no one in it would ever stand alone. No one would die because there was no money for medicine. No one would work themselves to death because there were no other choices. And now, lying in the penthouse, staring at the ceiling after a 2 a.m. call from a bartender who refused $50,000 to ask for health insurance for her daughter, Kieran Blackwell understood why he could not stop thinking about her. Not because of her appearance, not because she had saved his life, but because in his world where everyone had a price, where loyalty was bought with money and fear, Elise Dawson was the first person he had ever met who could not be bought. She refused $50,000 but asked for health insurance for her child, and Kieran saw in her a female version of himself, a survivor, someone who refused to break, someone who built a life from nothing with bare hands and an unbreakable will, and he knew he would meet her again. Not because he still owed her a debt, but because for the first time in his life, Kieran Blackwell wanted someone to see him, not as a boss, not as a businessman, but as the orphaned boy from South Boston. Kieran Blackwell began appearing at the bar where Elise worked, not once and then disappearing, but regularly, every 3 or 4 days, always around 10 in the evening, always at the same table in the far corner near the back door. The table no one liked because it blocked the view of the small stage, where a cheap jazz band sometimes played. But Kieran did not come for the music. He ordered a whiskey neat, opened a copy of the Financial Times he brought with him, and sat there reading, or pretending to read. Because although his eyes faced the page, they were always on Elise, on the way she carried a heavy tray past 4 tables without spilling a drop, even as her wrist trembled, on the way she smiled at customers, even after a 10-hour shift, when her legs must have ached enough to buckle. On the way, she wiped tables after customers left, with movements that were fast and efficient, and wasted nothing because she did not have time to waste. And Kieran, a man who had built an empire on the ability to read people, looked at Elise Dawson and read something he rarely saw in anyone: pride in poverty. Not arrogance, but pride. The kind of pride of someone who knows she is at the bottom, yet refuses to bow. The same pride Kieran once had at 15, standing in the rain at a cemetery and deciding the world could take his parents, but it could not take his will. Elise knew he was there. She was not foolish. A man in a suit reading the Financial Times did not sit in a cheap bar on this street without a reason. But she did not ask. She served him like any other customer, polite, professional, distant, and Kieran did not push. He came, sat, drank his whiskey, left a generous but not insulting tip, and left, and they played that game for weeks. He pretended to be a regular. She pretended not to know he was not, until one Saturday night when everything changed. That night, Mrs. Helen, the 72-year-old neighbor, who was the only person who watched Piper during Elise's night shifts, fell seriously ill and was hospitalized with pneumonia. And Elise had no one, not a single person in the world to call. No family, no close friends, no one. So she did the only thing she could. She brought Piper with her to the bar, settled the girl in the staff room with her homework, a glass of milk poured by a kind bartender, and the instruction to stay there, do her work, and not come out because her mother was right on the other side of the door. 8-year-old Piper sat in the corner of the staff room at a small table, pushed against the wall, a dim yellow light falling over an open math notebook, writing with a pencil worn so short it had to be held between 3 fingers. The glass of milk beside her, and she drank it in very small sips, spaced minutes apart, as if saving each drop, because she did not know when there would be another. And anyone watching the way that 8-year-old sat, completely silent, completely focused, not fidgeting, not complaining, not asking for anything, would understand this was not an ordinary child. This was a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible, who had learned to exist without disturbing anyone, who had learned to take care of herself before the world could remind her that no one else would. Kieran entered the staff room that night because Elise needed to check an old wound on his shoulder that had become slightly infected, and she told him, in a tone that allowed no refusal, that she was going to look at it because if it worsened he would need a hospital, and she did not want the previous rescue to be for nothing. And when Kieran sat down for her to examine him, he glanced toward the corner of the room and saw Piper for the first time. The girl looked up and met his eyes, and there was none of the reaction he expected from an 8-year-old seeing a stranger. No fear, no avoidance, no running to her mother. Piper simply looked straight into Kieran Blackwell's eyes and assessed him, truly assessed him, with the measuring gaze of a child who had seen enough adults to know not all were safe. And then she spoke in a calm voice, no 8-year-old should have, asking whether he was her mother's friend, and whether he had good intentions, because her mother had already met enough people without good intentions. Kieran heard those words and something shifted in his chest. Not pain and not pity, but recognition. Because looking into that child's eyes, he saw himself. The same gaze, the same vigilance, the same way of looking at a world already known to be unfair, yet not surrendered to. The eyes he had at 15 standing in a cemetery staring at his parents' graves. The eyes of an orphan in a world with no protection. And Kieran Blackwell, the Mafia Boss, the entire underworld feared. The man who never knelt to anyone, knelt right there in the staff room amid the smell of beer and disinfectant, lowering himself to the eye level of an 8-year-old girl, sipping milk sparingly, and said that he had good intentions. Piper studied him for 3 more seconds, eyes unblinking, weighing that answer with the instincts of a child who had seen her mother abandoned too many times. Then said that everyone said that and then they left, that her father had said that too and he left. So how could she know he was different? And Kieran, a man accustomed to commanding rather than explaining, a man whose words were law in the underworld, looked into the eyes of that 8-year-old child and said 2 words he had not said to anyone since his parents died. He promised, and he meant it. Because in that moment, kneeling before Piper Dawson, Kieran Blackwell was not a boss and not a businessman and not a man who built an empire from the shadows. He was the 15-year-old boy in the rain who had sworn that if he ever had a family, no one in it would ever stand alone. And the girl sitting before him, sipping milk carefully in a bar staff room at 10 at night, because her mother had no one to watch her. The girl whose eyes mirrored his so closely it felt like looking backward through time. That girl would become his daughter, even though neither Kieran nor Piper knew it yet. But in that staff room smelling of beer and disinfectant, between an 8-year-old holding a glass of milk and a mafia boss on his knees, a family began to form. Not by blood and not by paperwork, but by 2 words and the shared gaze of 2 people who knew what loss was and still chose to believe. 6 months after the night, Kieran knelt in the bar staff room and said, "I promised to an 8-year-old girl," sipping her milk carefully. Elise and Piper moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood on the west side of the city, with large windows overlooking a small park where joggers passed in the mornings and children played on swings in the afternoons. And Elise agreed to move only after Kieran accepted her one condition, that she would pay the monthly rent with her own salary. Kieran nodded and said okay, even though they both knew he owned the entire building and would never take $1 from her. But he understood that Elise needed this. She needed to know she wasn't an ornament bought with money. She needed to know she was still standing on her own feet, even though those feet were tired after 12 years of constant running. And that understanding and patience were what made Elise begin to believe that maybe Kieran Blackwell truly was different from every man she had ever known. A few months later, Kieran and Elise began dating, so slowly that Finn once looked at his boss in confusion because he had never seen Kieran Blackwell, the most decisive man he knew, show such patience with anyone. But Kieran knew Elise had been betrayed too many times to rush. She was wary of every promise because she had heard too many swallowed whole. And one evening, as they sat on a park bench watching Piper play, she told him that she had trusted a man once, and he left her with a child and a mountain of debt, that she loved her daughter more than her own life, but wasn't sure her heart could survive being abandoned again. And Kieran sat beside her without touching her hand, because she wasn't ready, watching Piper hang upside down on the bars with the rare wide smile of a child allowed to be a child. And he said he wasn't that man and he would prove it with time, not words. 6 months later, on an ordinary Sunday morning that no one would have guessed would become one of the most important moments of Kieran Blackwell's life, he stood in the apartment kitchen, flipping pancakes for breakfast, while Finn sat at the table drinking coffee and reading the paper, because he had arrived early to report work, and Kieran made him eat first, and from the living room came a small, clear voice, natural as if it had been said 1,000 times before, though it never had, saying, "Dad, I want more syrup." Kieran froze with the spatula in his hand, the flame under the pan still burning, the pancake beginning to scorch, but he didn't move, because that word "dad" wasn't programmed, wasn't taught, wasn't discussed or prepared. It came from Piper Dawson's mouth as naturally as breathing, as if in the mind of that 8.5-year-old girl, Kieran Blackwell had been her father for a long time, and today was simply the day she finally said it out loud. Kieran had to turn away because his eyes burned so badly that if he blinked, the tears would fall. And Kieran Blackwell didn't cry in front of anyone. Not ever, never had. But that single word from a child reached a place 20 years in the underworld had never touched. The place where the 15-year-old boy standing in the rain at a cemetery was still waiting for someone to call him home. And Finn saw it all from the table, said nothing, only gave a small nod and went back to reading. Because Finn had followed Kieran long enough to know that sometimes silence was the greatest respect a person could give. By the following year, Kieran formally adopted Piper, complete and legal paperwork. Piper Dawson became Piper Blackwell, and Elise and Kieran married in a ceremony so small it almost felt wrong to call it a wedding, with Finn standing behind Kieran in a suit he clearly wasn't comfortable wearing, Reed taking photos without being asked, Jace guarding the door out of habit even though there was no threat, and Mrs. Helen, the 72-year-old neighbor recovered from pneumonia, sitting in the front row wiping tears with a flower-embroidered handkerchief, while Piper stood beside her mother holding a small bouquet and smiling, the smile of a child who finally had both words father and mother to write in the family section of her school forms. Piper transferred to Pemberton Academy, the best private school in the city, with tuition of $35,000 a year, Kieran enrolling her under the name of Blackwell Enterprises so no one knew who he really was, and Piper, though she now had a closet full of new clothes with tags still on, though she now lived in a penthouse overlooking the entire city, still wore the old denim jacket to school every day, the $3 jacket from Goodwill, with mismatched blue stitching, and a patch cut from her mother's torn jeans. She hung it in the most honored place in her closet among jackets costing hundreds of dollars, and when Kieran once asked if she wanted him to buy her a new one, Piper looked at her father with the seriousness of a 10-year-old who had lived far beyond her age, and said that her mother had wrapped that jacket around her on nights they slept in the car, that she could smell her mother in it, that no jacket in the world could replace it, and asked him not to ask again. And Kieran never did, because he understood more deeply than anyone, since he too had things that couldn't be replaced. The borrowed suit he wore at his parents' burial, still lying at the bottom of his office closet where no one was allowed to touch it. What Piper didn't know was that after that conversation, Kieran quietly hired a textile conservation specialist to come while Piper was at school, who applied an ultra-thin protective lining inside the denim jacket to guard it from sweat, rain, and time, a layer so fine it couldn't be felt by hand, didn't change the scent or the feel. Piper never noticed, but Elise did, because Kieran told her, and that night Elise held her husband and cried for a long time, not from sadness, but because for the first time in her 31 years, she understood what it meant to be loved the right way, not love made of empty promises like Brandon, not conditional love she had never received from her parents, but the love of a man who waterproofed a $3 jacket because he understood it was the most valuable thing in this home, more valuable than the penthouse, more valuable than the cars, more valuable even than the empire he had built, because it carried 4 winter months in a car and the promise of a mother who never left her child. And now you understand what that jacket means. You understand why when Janet Crawford threw it in the trash and cut it in half in front of 30 children, she didn't just destroy an object, she destroyed 4 winter months, destroyed a mother's promise, destroyed a symbol of survival, destroyed the most sacred thing in the Blackwell family. And if you want to know how Kieran Blackwell, the man who built an empire from the shadows and never forgave anyone who touched his family, will respond, subscribe and turn on notifications now, because what comes next will show you why no one in this city dares to say his name. Kieran Blackwell's office sat on the 38th floor of the Blackwell Enterprises building, the entire level, an open space wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the whole city, and at the moment the watch on his wrist vibrated, he was seated at the head of a long conference table with 6 people, key figures from both the legitimate and illegitimate sides of his network. The meeting 40 minutes in, while someone was presenting a real estate project in the southern part of the city, when Kieran glanced down at his wrist, read the message glowing on the screen, and everything stopped. Miss Crawford, she hit me. She cut Mom's jacket. 14 words. And Kieran Blackwell's world shifted from light to shadow in a single heartbeat. He did not shout, did not slam the table, did not leap to his feet. There was none of the violence people imagined from a mafia boss hearing that his daughter had been attacked. What happened was far more terrifying than any of that. Kieran went completely silent, utterly silent. But his face changed, not contorted by rage but emptied by it, every expression draining away as if someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes, and what remained was something the 6 people in the room saw and instinctively understood, with the purest survival sense, that they needed to leave this room immediately, without questions, without words, without even breathing too loudly. Just go. Kieran stood, buttoned his suit jacket with 2 fingers in movements, so slow and precise they felt mechanical, his voice calm, as if he were canceling a lunch appointment, rather than containing a fury capable of burning down the building. Cancel everything today. And the 6 people gathered their papers and exited the room in 11 seconds. No one asked why. No one looked back, because they had worked with Kieran long enough to know that when his face became that empty, it was the most dangerous moment. Kieran Blackwell's anger did not explode. It froze, an ice cut deeper than fire. 3 minutes later, the conference room doors opened without a knock, because in this world only 3 people had that privilege. Finn entered first, 38 years old, his longest-serving lieutenant, who had stood beside Kieran since the earliest days on the streets of South Boston, followed by Reed, 33, the technology and hacking specialist, who had built the entire information and cybersecurity system of the Blackwell Empire, and finally Jace, 42, an infiltration expert with a face so ordinary it was brilliant, a face people forgot the moment they looked away, the perfect face for someone who needed to go anywhere without being remembered. These 3 men were not just Kieran's operators. They were family, and they knew Piper. They loved Piper in the way hard men never admitted aloud but showed through action. Finn was Uncle Finn, the one Piper played checkers with every Sunday afternoon, and who always lost because he let her win even though he claimed otherwise. Reed taught Piper basic Python, and she wrote her first Hello World line and proudly showed it to everyone for a full week, Jace taught her chess and had lost to her 3 games in a row last week, this time losing for real, not on purpose. Kieran spoke briefly, each word landing like a bullet. A teacher slapped my daughter and cut Elise's jacket to pieces. Her name is Janet Crawford, Pemberton Academy, and the air in the room thickened. 3 hard faces exchanged a look that lasted 1 second, unreadable to outsiders but perfectly clear to them. The look of men who had just heard that someone had touched a child they considered their own blood. Finn, the quietest of the 3, reacted first. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscle at his temple rose beneath the skin. His eyes darkened, and he asked in a low voice Kieran heard only when all limits had been crossed. "What are the orders, boss?" Kieran walked to the glass wall and looked out over the city spread below, his back to the 3 most loyal men he had, and said, "I want everything on Janet Crawford. Work history, finances, social media, traffic violations, prescriptions. I want to know what she fears. I want to know what she loves. I want to know what she is hiding." Then he turned back. "About the school, Pemberton Academy, policies, administration, funding sources. I want to know who protects teachers like this." Then he paused, looked at each man in turn. "Find out if she has done this to any other child before. If she has, I want those families protected, because not every family has me standing behind them." And finally, his voice softer but sharper, the tone Finn knew was the most dangerous of all, "I want her destroyed, but not turned into a victim. No violence, no direct threats. She must lose everything slowly enough to understand why it is happening. Her job, her reputation, her sense of safety. I want her to feel exactly what my daughter felt, powerless, judged, with nowhere to hide." Kieran Blackwell drove to Pemberton Academy alone, without Finn and without anyone else, because there are things a father must do by himself, and when he walked through the iron gates of a school that cost $35,000 a year in handmade leather shoes and a gray suit worth a teacher's annual salary, the receptionist looked at him and then looked again, not because of the expensive clothes, since many parents here wore expensive clothes, but because of the way he moved, every step precise, every step deliberate, the way he looked straight ahead without glancing left or right as if the world around him did not exist except for the medical room door at the end of the hall. Kieran opened the door and saw his daughter, Piper, sitting on a small chair, with her feet not touching the floor, her back straight, her eyes facing forward, the 2 pieces of the denim jacket folded neatly and aligned in her lap. The slap mark on her left cheek faded from red to a pale purple and beginning to swell. The cold pack still untouched on the table. And when Piper looked up and saw her father, she said in a voice so calm it tore him apart, "Dad is here." No tears, no trembling, no running into his arms, just a statement, as if she were commenting on the weather. And that calmness was what destroyed Kieran from the inside, because he knew what it meant. It meant his daughter was wearing the armor life had forced her to put on at 5 years old, armor no child should ever have. Kieran knelt in front of Piper just as he had knelt before her in the bar staff room 2 years earlier, level with her eyes, and he lifted his hand gently to her left cheek, his fingers fitting perfectly over the swollen mark, the warmth of a father's hand placed exactly where the cold hand of an abuser had left its trace, as if he were trying to erase it with his own heat, and he asked in the softest voice he could manage whether she was in pain. Piper shook her head, then looked down at the jacket pieces in her lap, and for the first time her voice cracked, just a hairline fracture like a crack in glass you would miss if you were not looking closely. She said that the teacher cut Mom's jacket, and she tried to hold it, but the teacher was faster. Kieran pulled his daughter into his arms, wrapping both hands around her small body and holding her tight enough for her to feel his heart beating fast and hard. But what Piper did not know was that her father was shaking. Not from fear, because Kieran Blackwell feared no one in this world. He was shaking from rage. A rage he was using every ounce of will to contain because his daughter did not need to see that. She needed her dad, not a boss. And Kieran bit down hard as he held her, until he was certain that when he let go, his face would be a father's face, and not the face that had emptied a conference room in 11 seconds. On the drive home with Piper in the back seat clutching the 2 jacket pieces, Kieran called Elise, who was at home managing a children's charity fund Kieran supported, and where Elise had found a new purpose. She listened as he spoke carefully, weighing every word, and when he finished there was silence on the line for 5 seconds. The longest 5 seconds of the call. Then Elise spoke, her voice steady, hard as steel. The voice of a woman who had survived an alcoholic father, an abandoning lover, 4 winter months in a car, and now someone had touched her child. She asked if the teacher had cut the jacket, and Kieran said she cut it in half with scissors. 3 more seconds of silence. Then Elise spoke in a voice Kieran had never heard from his wife, telling him to bring their daughter home, and asking whether he would handle the teacher or she would. And Kieran said he would handle it. And Elise said one last thing before hanging up, telling him not to go to prison for someone who was not worth it. And Kieran said he promised. That night in the penthouse at 10 o'clock, Piper was bathed and in pajamas sitting on the bed. She looked fine, normal, controlled, and Elise sat beside her, stroking her hair and looking at the bruise on her daughter's cheek, now clearer under the bedroom light, and she said gently that Piper did not have to be strong in front of her. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the mask collapsed and Piper cried. Not a small cry and not a few tears wiped away, but the kind of crying where everything she had held in all day and all her life broke open at once, her body shaking as she curled into her mother's arms, fists clutching Elise's shirt, face buried in her chest. And that cry was not the cry of a child who had been slapped. It was the cry of a child who had not cried for far too long, from nights pretending to sleep while her mother cried in the bathroom, from meals where she ate half a bowl and said she was full, from 10 years of never being allowed to fall apart. She asked why the teacher hated her and what she had done wrong when she had only worn her mother's jacket, and Elise held her tighter, tears falling but her voice steady because she had trained her entire life to keep it steady when her child needed it, telling Piper she had done nothing wrong. Never. Listen to her. Nothing wrong. But Piper kept crying and said the thing Elise feared most, the thought she had spent her life trying to keep her daughter from ever having. She repeated that the teacher said the jacket smelled like the slums and asked whether their home was a slum, and Elise choked because 10 years earlier the answer had been yes, because they had been homeless and slept in a car and gone hungry, and Elise had done everything to make sure Piper would never be ashamed of that. And one teacher shattered it all with a sentence and a pair of scissors. But Elise Dawson did not break now, because she had not broken in 10 years, and would not break tonight. She spoke very softly, but very clearly, telling her daughter that they had been homeless, and slept in a car, and gone hungry, and that was not shame. It was proof they survived. That jacket was not trash. It was a medal, and no one had the right to take that from her. Piper cried until she fell asleep in her mother's arms, still clutching the 2 pieces of the $3 denim jacket. Outside the bedroom door, Kieran Blackwell stood with his back against the wall, having heard every word from, "Why does she hate me?" to, "Are we from the slums?" And he did not enter because he did not trust himself to control his face, and his daughter did not need to see what was burning behind his eyes. She needed her mother and warm arms and a steady voice, not her father's anger turning into something colder than anger, deeper than anger, slower than anger but far more destructive. Kieran walked to his study, closed the door, sat down, lifted his phone, called Finn, and spoke in a tone. Finn had heard only 3 times in 20 years, each time someone paid an extraordinary price, telling him there were no limits left, and to destroy her. 24 hours after Kieran's call saying there were no limits left, the machinery of the Blackwell Empire began to move, with the cold precision of a system designed never to fail, every gear turning for the same reason. For the 10-year-old girl who called them uncle, for the child who had cried in her mother's arms the night before, and asked whether their home was a slum, and because none of them could bear that question. Reed sat in the technical room at Blackwell Enterprises headquarters, with 4 monitors glowing in front of him, his fingers moving across the keyboard at a speed the average person could not follow, and the firewall of Pemberton Academy, a private school rather than the Pentagon, took 47 minutes to breach. Reed told Finn it was insultingly easy, the school's security weaker than a neighbor's restaurant Wi-Fi password, and when he entered the internal email system, what he found made him stop, remove his glasses, wipe them, put them back on, and read again to be sure he was not mistaken. 9 complaints over the past 5 years. 9 families who had filed formal reports to the administration about Janet Crawford, all from low-income families or scholarship recipients, all describing the same pattern of behavior: discrimination, humiliation, and systematic bullying aimed at children Crawford believed did not belong at the school. And all 9 complaints had been dismissed by the same person, Principal Thomas Greer, using reasons so identical they read like copy and paste. Cultural misunderstanding, overly sensitive parents, matter discussed with the teacher, and resolved internally. What made Reed clench his jaw was not the 9 dismissed complaints, but an email thread between Crawford and Greer from 3 weeks before the incident with Piper. Crawford had written with the subject line "Students not meeting standards," complaining about students with questionable family backgrounds who did not fit the school's image and whose parent was a former server. No name mentioned, but Reed knew she meant Piper, and Greer replied with a single line, telling her to handle it as she saw fit and maintain the school's image. 7 words that functioned like a weaponless execution order, 7 words in which the principal of a $35,000 a year school granted a teacher permission to abuse a child he deemed unworthy. Reed then uncovered what made everything far worse. The security camera in classroom 203 had been reported as malfunctioning on the day Crawford attacked Piper. But malfunctioning did not mean broken. Reed checked the system logs and found the camera had been disabled from the central system at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before class began. Using Janet Crawford's own login credentials, she had personally shut off the camera before acting, deliberately, with preparation. This was not a teacher losing control in a moment of anger. This was a 48-year-old woman who sat at her desk at 7:45, logged in, turned off her classroom camera, and calmly waited for students to arrive to carry out exactly what she had planned. But Crawford did not know that nothing is ever truly erased from a server. And Reed restored the entire footage frame by frame with sound, capturing everything from the moment Crawford snarled for the child to take off that filthy thing, to the sound of scissors cutting fabric in a silent classroom. While Reed excavated Crawford's digital world, Jace was already inside Pemberton Academy. He had applied for a maintenance position the previous afternoon, interviewed in the morning, and been hired immediately because the school was understaffed, and Jace's face was the kind interviewers forgot the moment he left the room. Ordinary to the point of genius, that was his gift. Jace could stand in a crowded room and no one would remember he had been there. On his first day, he cleaned hallways, wiped windows, and observed quietly. On the second day, he accessed classroom 203 after school once Crawford had left, opened the teacher's desk drawer, and what he found made him stand still for a long time even though Jace never stopped for anything. The 2 pieces of Piper's denim jacket lay inside, not tossed carelessly but folded neatly, and aligned as if Crawford had taken time to arrange them after cutting them. She had not thrown them away. She had kept them, kept the pieces she had destroyed like trophies, like a hunter mounting a kill. And Jace, the man who had lost 3 chess games in a row to Piper the week before and laughed as she celebrated, had to draw a deep breath to keep himself steady. The desk drawer was not the only discovery. Jace found a small cabinet in the corner of the classroom secured with a personal lock he opened in 30 seconds. Inside were items he photographed one by one, because he knew that when Kieran saw them, he would understand Piper was not the first. The cabinet contained confiscated belongings, collected over years, a worn cloth doll, a cheap plastic butterfly hair clip, a diary with a lock and a child's name scribbled in crayon on the cover, a multicolored plastic bracelet made by a child's own hands, all personal items, all belonging to children, all cheap with no material value but priceless to those who owned them, and all shared one thing: they belonged to poor children and scholarship students, children Crawford had decided were unworthy, and she had confiscated their belongings and never returned them, keeping them locked away like a private gallery of victories belonging to a systematic bully. That afternoon, Jace recorded a conversation between Crawford and a colleague in the teacher's lounge. Crawford recounted the incident with Piper without remorse and with something like pride. She laughed lightly and said that the girl finally knew her place, and that some children needed to be reminded where they were and by whose grace. And the colleague said nothing, neither objecting nor agreeing, just remaining silent. And that silence, too, was a form of complicity that Jace captured second by second. While Reed dug through the digital world and Jace gathered physical evidence from inside Pemberton, Finn handled the part no technology could replace. He went to find people, the 9 families behind the 9 complaints Principal Greer had thrown into the trash over 5 years. 9 families Crawford targeted because she knew they lacked the resources to fight back. And Finn found them not with computers, but with his feet, with patient phone calls, with drives through different neighborhoods knocking on doors one by one. Because Finn understood these families had already been betrayed by the system once, and would not trust anyone knocking on their door unless that person looked them in the eye and spoke the truth. The first family Finn visited was the Torres family. Living in a small apartment in the eastern part of the city, Miguel's mother, Rosa Torres, was a single woman, working as a hotel housekeeper. She opened the door and looked at Finn with the wary eyes of someone long accustomed to being treated poorly by the world. And when Finn said he had come because of her son at Pemberton, her eyes changed, not with fear but with pain. An old pain she thought she had buried rising to the surface like a wound that never healed. She told him that 9-year-old Miguel had been forced by Crawford to sit alone at a desk in the corner of the classroom for 3 months, separated from his friends, with the reason given that his worn clothes ruined the classroom's appearance and negatively affected the learning environment of other students. 3 months of a 9-year-old child sitting alone in a corner as if quarantined for the crime of being poor. 3 months during which Miguel came home silent, stopped eating, and began saying he did not want to go to school anymore. And when Rosa went to the school to complain, Crawford looked her up and down and said in a falsely sweet voice that perhaps she should spend time taking care of her child instead of complaining, or accept it, or transfer schools. And Rosa, an immigrant woman with no money for a lawyer and no knowledge of her rights, chose to move her son to a public school because she did not know what else she could do. The second family was the Park family. Soo-Yun's parents were a Korean couple who owned a small laundromat on Main Street. Soo-Yun was 10, good at math, always turned in her work on time, but Crawford returned her math test marked with an F and a red ink comment, written carefully as if she had thought through every word. Tell your parents to invest in education instead of lottery tickets. This result accurately reflects your family background. Mrs. Park had kept that test for 2 years. She took it out to show Finn with trembling hands, the paper wrinkled from being folded and unfolded too many times, and she said that Soo-Yun quit advanced math after receiving that test, even though she loved math, because Crawford had killed her joy for the subject with a single red line of ink. The third family was the Okafor family. Nigerian immigrants. The father, an information technology engineer whose son had received a scholarship to Pemberton, and during the first parent meeting of the year, when Mr. Okafor stood to introduce himself in polite, proud English with a Nigerian accent, Crawford turned to the colleague beside her and said loudly enough for the table to hear that they were outsiders who should be grateful they were even allowed there. The colleague heard it but did not dare speak up. Mr. Okafor heard it but stayed silent because he feared that reacting would cost his son the scholarship. And the Okafor family moved away 3 months later, not because of Crawford alone, but because Mr. Okafor could not bear watching his son put on his uniform every morning to attend a school where his father had been called an outsider and do nothing. That helplessness ate at him from the inside, until he decided leaving was the only way to protect what remained of his family's dignity. Finn visited each family one by one, unhurried, without pressure, without threats. He simply sat down, looked them in the eye, and said, "There is someone who wants to make sure what happened to your child never happens to another child. We can provide lawyers and financial support. You only need to tell the truth." And out of the 9 families, 7 agreed. 7 families who had been silent for too long, out of fear and helplessness, finally saw that someone was listening. The remaining 2 refused because they had moved too far away and were too exhausted to look back. And Finn respected that decision, because he understood not everyone has the strength to fight, and that was not their fault. 9 stories, 9 children, 9 families. And when Reed compiled everything together, internal emails, restored camera footage, photographs of the drawer holding the jacket like a trophy, photographs of the confiscated items cabinet, recordings of Crawford boasting in the teacher's lounge, statements from 7 families, Crawford's financial records and work history, all of it bound into a 200-page dossier, complete, precise, undeniable. And Reed placed it on Kieran's desk at 11 at night, on the 4th day after the order was given. Kieran read all 200 pages in silence, alone in his office with the desk lamp on and the city asleep beneath the window. He read every page, every email, looked at every photograph, listened to every recording, read Rosa Torres's statement about Miguel sitting alone in the corner for 3 months. Read the red ink comment on Soo-Yun Park's test. Read Greer's email saying handle it as you see fit. Looked at the photograph of the cabinet filled with confiscated children's belongings, the worn cloth doll, the butterfly hair clip, the locked diary, the plastic bracelet, things not worth $1 yet worth an entire world to a child. And he read for 2 straight hours without stopping, without drinking water, without standing up, 200 pages, and when he finished, he closed the folder, placed both hands on the desk, looked out the window into the darkness of the sleeping city, and spoke a single sentence into the empty room. his voice not loud but carrying the weight of each word like stone pressing on the chest. "She did not just hit my daughter. She built an entire career on bullying children she believed no one would protect. 9 children, 5 years, and no one stopped her. Because every time she chose the right victims, the right families without money for lawyers, without power, without voices loud enough to be heard. But this time," and Kieran paused, his finger tapping lightly on the cover of the 200-page folder. "This time she chose the wrong child." Janet Crawford arrived home at 5 in the evening on the 5th day since she cut Piper Blackwell's denim jacket. After a day in which Principal Greer had called her into his office for what he described as a consultation and told her she should be more careful because it seemed a parent was making a big deal out of things, and Greer spoke with the calm confidence of a man who believed this would pass as it had 9 times before, and Crawford believed it too. She was tired but assured, because 14 years in the classroom and 5 years of Greer's protection had taught her that poor families could not fight the system. They complained, and then went quiet. They threatened, and then stopped. They transferred schools and disappeared. And the Blackwell family would be no different. She thought that as she climbed the stairs, she still thought that as she put her hand on the bedroom doorknob, and she stopped thinking it at the exact moment the door opened. The denim jacket lay in the center of her bed, precisely between the pillows, the 2 pieces she had cut with scissors in front of 30 children now placed side by side, fitted together perfectly as if they had never been separated. The cut aligned millimeter by millimeter. The jacket had been washed, pressed, and folded with a care Crawford recognized instantly because she herself had folded it that way when she placed it in her desk drawer like a trophy, and now someone had taken it from that drawer, brought it here, washed it, pressed it, folded it, and placed it on her bed, on her pillow, in the most private space of her home. Beside the jacket sat a small black USB drive, and on the pillow a white sheet of paper with handwritten words in steady, unhurried script, every stroke radiating the absolute calm of the writer. "You threw this into the trash. You cut it with scissors. We retrieved it from your desk drawer, where you kept it like a trophy. The USB contains everything we know about you. Plug it into your computer or do not. We do not care, because whether you watch or not, everyone else will. This is 10% of what we have." Crawford looked around the bedroom, her hand shaking so badly the paper fluttered between her fingers. The windows were closed and locked, the locks intact. No signs of forced entry, no scratches on the doorframe, no shoe prints on the floor. Nothing in the room disturbed except the jacket on the pillow. Someone had entered her house while she was at work, passed through the living room, gone upstairs, into her bedroom, placed the items on her bed, and left, as if they had a key, as if they had been there many times, as if they lived there. And that realization was the most terrifying part. Not the jacket, not the paper, not the USB, but the knowledge that someone could stand there, right there, beside the bed where she slept every night, and she would never know. Crawford called Greer, her hand shaking so much she dialed the wrong number twice, and after he listened, he replied in the same calm tone that made her want to scream at him. "Janet, calm down. It is probably the girl's family making empty threats. Change the locks and forget it." And Crawford nearly shouted that they had been inside her house, inside her bedroom. But Greer had already hung up, because Thomas Greer was the kind of man who excelled at covering things up only while they remained under control, and vanished faster than anyone once they were not. On the second night, Crawford did not sleep. She lay on the living room sofa because she was afraid to enter the bedroom, her eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, and at 2 in the morning she could not take it anymore. She plugged the USB into her laptop, and what appeared on the screen drained the blood from her face. Restored classroom camera footage, clear, with sound, capturing everything from the moment she snarled her command to the moment the scissors sliced through fabric. Then 9 PDF files, each one a complaint dossier from a family with photographs of the child, parent statements, scans of internal emails between Crawford and Greer, and at the end of the drive a single text file that read, "This is 10% of what we have." On the third day, Crawford woke on the sofa at 6 in the morning, went to the garage to drive to school, and her car was not there. The garage was empty. She stood staring at the space where her old Toyota Camry had been parked for 12 years. Then she ran outside and found it, parked neatly at the curb 3 blocks away, doors locked, no scratches, no signs of damage, the paint still shiny, the mirrors intact, the car keys still hanging on the kitchen hook exactly where she placed them every night. Someone had entered her house again, taken the keys, driven the car 3 blocks, parked it, locked it, returned the keys to their place, and left. And the message was so clear it did not need words. We can take anything you own, but we are choosing not to. No vandalism, no violent threat, only proof of one thing, that she no longer controlled anything in her life. Not who entered her home, not who touched her belongings, not who moved her car. And that was more terrifying than any threat. On the 4th day, 7 silent calls came, each ringing exactly 3 times before disconnecting. When she blocked one number, another called, each number used once and then vanished. 7 calls spaced evenly throughout the day. Not frequent enough to be harassment, but steady enough that Crawford could never forget someone was watching. Someone was counting her breaths. Someone was patiently waiting. And that patience destroyed her from the inside, because it showed that whoever was behind this was not in a hurry. They had time, they had resources, they had the ability to enter her home whenever they wished, without leaving a trace. And they were choosing to do everything slowly, day by day, step by step, like a cat playing with a mouse. On the 5th day, an anonymous email was sent simultaneously to every parent at Pemberton Academy, every member of the school board, and 4 local television stations. The email contained 5 years of complaints, internal emails between Crawford and Greer, and the restored classroom 203 camera footage, everything, all of it, packed into a single message sent to hundreds of recipients at once. And Crawford knew at the moment her phone began vibrating nonstop with messages from colleagues, from parents, from unknown numbers, that her world had just been torn apart, not by hands, not by scissors, but by the truth, and truth cannot be stitched back together. On the night of the 5th day at 11:47, Crawford stood at the bedroom window she had begun sleeping in again, because the sofa hurt her back too much. She looked out through the gap in the curtains, and across the street under a streetlight stood 2 men in suits, motionless, not smoking, not talking, not looking at phones, just standing there, just looking up at her window, and Crawford dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she had to hold the phone with both of them. The police arrived 8 minutes later, but when they came, no one was there. No footprints, no cigarette butts, nothing to prove the 2 figures had ever existed. The officer looked at Crawford with the same expression she had once used on parents who came to the school to complain, pity mixed with suspicion, and he said, "Mrs. Crawford, perhaps you should speak to someone. Prolonged stress can cause hallucinations." And Crawford stood in the doorway watching the patrol car drive away, understanding that she was completely alone. No one believed her. No one would help her. No one was on her side. And for the first time in her life, Janet Crawford felt exactly what the 9 children she had bullied had felt. Powerless, isolated, with nowhere safe, and no one listening. Dennis Crawford watched the video on Friday night, sitting in the living room on the sofa where his wife had curled up for 3 nights straight, the laptop on the coffee table, and he pressed play. And for the next 4 minutes and 23 seconds, Dennis Crawford, a 50-year-old gentle, timid accountant who had married Janet 23 years earlier because she was strong and confident, and he admired that confidence, watched his wife rip a denim jacket off a 10-year-old child, throw it into the trash, slap that child in front of 30 classmates, then take scissors and cut the jacket in half with a triumphant smile he had never seen on her face before, or perhaps had seen but had never wanted to acknowledge. And when the video ended, Dennis said nothing. He closed the laptop very slowly, then sat for a long time in the living room, with his hands on his thighs, staring at the wall across from him, while Janet stood in the kitchen doorway watching her husband, waiting for him to say something, anything, waiting for him to defend her as she had always expected whenever the world turned its back. But when Dennis finally spoke, his voice was not angry and not sad. It was empty like a classroom after the bell, and he said, "Janet, you really slapped a 10-year-old child and then cut her jacket in front of the whole class." Not a question, but a statement. And Janet began to explain, began talking about standards, about discipline, about unsuitable students, but Dennis had already stood up and gone upstairs without looking back. The next morning, the teachers' union called. Janet had contacted them on the 3rd day, hoping that the organization that had protected teachers' rights for decades would stand by her, but the representative's voice on the line was cold as ice. "We have reviewed the file, Mrs. Crawford. The evidence is overwhelming. The video, the internal emails, 9 complaints over 5 years. We cannot defend this conduct. "You need private counsel. We are sorry." And the line went dead. 45 seconds. That was all the time the union gave to Janet Crawford's 14 years of service before cutting her off from its protection like pruning a dead branch. Colleagues kept their distance. People who had shared a lunch table with Crawford every day now changed their lunch hour, changed tables, or ate in their classrooms. No one wanted to be seen standing next to Janet Crawford now. No one wanted their name appearing anywhere near hers in any context. And Crawford understood that collegial loyalty was thinner than paper when one's own career was at risk. Then Crawford's sister called, Margaret, also a teacher in another district. And Janet answered with a final flicker of hope that at least blood family would stand with her. But Margaret's voice was shaking and rigid, the voice of someone saying what they did not want to say but had to. "Janet, I have read everything. 9 families, 5 years, emails with the principal, the video. I watched the video 3 times because I could not believe it the first time. This is not a mistake, Janet. This is a pattern, a system, a choice. And I do not know what to say. I am ashamed to share your last name. I am ashamed to share the profession with you." And the line was silent for 5 seconds before Margaret hung up, and Janet Crawford stood in the kitchen holding the phone to her ear, listening to the steady tone of the ended call without lowering her hand, because lowering it meant admitting the call was over, that her sister had hung up, that even blood had turned away, that she was now truly and completely alone. That night the Crawford house was dark, curtains drawn tight over every window, all lights off because Crawford did not want light leaking out for someone across the street to know she was home. Dennis slept upstairs or pretended to sleep, and Crawford curled on the sofa in the dark holding Whiskers, the 12-year-old tabby cat, the only creature in the house that did not judge her, did not look at her with disappointment, did not hang up, did not avoid her. Whiskers simply curled in her arms and purred steadily, and Crawford sat there curled into the corner of the sofa, knees pulled to her chest, both arms wrapped tight around the cat, eyes open but seeing nothing in the darkness. And that posture, the way she made herself small, the way she clutched the only thing giving her warmth, the way she curled in fear and loneliness in the dark, was identical down to every detail to the way Piper Dawson had once curled inside their rusted, freezing vehicle during a Tennessee winter, wrapped in a $3 denim jacket, a newborn and her mother with no home, no one, only each other and the jacket. And now Janet Crawford, at 48, sat in her own house feeling as if she had no home at all. She had Whiskers as Piper had the jacket. She curled in the dark as Piper had curled in the car. And for the first time, even without consciously realizing it, Crawford was feeling exactly what the 9 children she had bullied had felt. Isolated, watched, with nowhere safe, no one listening, no one believing, no one on her side. 2 days later, Crawford received a letter of unpaid suspension from the school, a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks, and she hired a lawyer, an experienced labor attorney she found with her last savings. His name was Harrison, gray hair, gold-rimmed glasses, 30 years in practice, and he sat reading the 200-page file Crawford had printed from the USB for 3 hours straight in his small office. Not speaking, just turning pages, taking notes, occasionally pausing to frown before continuing. And when he finished, he removed his glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at Crawford with an expression she had seen enough times in the past week to recognize immediately, the look of someone who had reached a verdict before speaking. And he said, "Mrs. Crawford, I will be direct. This is the worst file I have read in 30 years of practice. The video is clear. The internal emails prove a cover-up. 9 families are prepared to testify, and you personally disabled the camera before acting, which means you cannot claim a momentary loss of control. You should accept the loss of your teaching license and negotiate a settlement. If this goes to court, you will lose, and you will lose badly." Crawford went home after meeting the lawyer, sat at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and for the first time, watched the video again, not to look for a defense, but to look, really look. She watched herself in the video, walk toward Piper's desk with eyes cold as steel. Watched herself tear the denim jacket from the 10-year-old. Watched herself throw it into the trash with a triumphant smile. Watched herself swing her hand and slap a child 38 years younger than her. Watched herself take scissors and cut the jacket with an expression Crawford could find no words for other than enjoyment. The woman in that video was enjoying destroying a child's keepsake, and Crawford stared at that woman for a long time, rewound, watched again, rewound, watched again. and asked herself in the quiet kitchen where Dennis had not come down for dinner 3 nights in a row who the woman in that video was, because she did not recognize her, or she did recognize her, recognized her clearly in every expression and gesture. And that was the most frightening part of all. More frightening than the 2 men across the street. More frightening than the jacket on the pillow. More frightening than the moved car, because the 2 men could disappear. The jacket could be put away. The car could be locked again. But the woman in that video lived inside Crawford. She was Crawford. And Crawford could not run from herself. Channel 5 aired the first report at 6 o'clock on the 9th day. A female reporter standing outside the gates of Pemberton Academy, with a grave expression as the lower third read, "Private school teacher abuses student. Administration covered it up for years." The classroom video played with Piper's face blurred, but Crawford's voice, unmistakable, every word clear. "Take that filthy thing off. That jacket smells like the slums." The slap cracking, the scissors slicing through fabric, all broadcast during prime time as millions of families sat down to dinner. And within 2 hours, Channel 4 and Channel 9 followed with their own angles. Channel 4, interviewing a child psychologist, analyzing the long-term impact of school abuse. Channel 9 focusing on Pemberton's cover-up, under a glaring red headline. 9 complaints. 5 years. Not one action. And before the night ended, the video Wyatt Chen had filmed with shaking hands from under a desk was uploaded online and reached 2 million views, comments flooding with outrage, the hashtag Justice for Piper climbing to national trending, and the world beyond Pemberton Academy's 4 walls finally seeing what 9 families had tried to say for 5 years, while no one listened. 7 families spoke out in a joint interview aired by Channel 5 the next day. Rosa Torres seated at the center, not crying because she had cried enough, calmly describing 9-year-old Miguel sitting alone in a classroom corner for 3 months because of worn clothes. Mrs. Park beside her holding Suyun's math test marked in red ink with the line, "Results reflect your family background," a paper she had kept for 2 years like evidence of a crime no one believed. Mr. Okafor, recounting the parents' meeting where he was called an outsider who should be grateful, his voice shaking as he said he left the city because he could not watch his son wear a uniform to a school where his father was humiliated. And each story added a piece to a complete picture. Crawford was not a single person. Making one mistake, Crawford was the product of a system that had protected her for 5 years, a system Principal Thomas Greer built and maintained with 7 words, "Handle it as you see fit." Thomas Greer took a call from the district superintendent at 7 the next morning. The voice on the other end did not need to raise itself, because the silence between sentences carried enough weight. "My office, now." And Greer drove there, gripping the steering wheel, his stomach twisting because he had known. He had known since the email bomb went out that this day would come. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. Greer was given 2 choices: resign or be publicly terminated, and he chose resignation because at least that preserved a final sliver of dignity, though in truth there was none left to preserve. 25 years in education, 25 years building a reputation, 25 years being called Principal Greer with respect, all collapsed in a single morning. And as Greer drove out the back gate to avoid the reporters at the front, he looked in the rearview mirror and watched Pemberton Academy shrink and disappear. 25 years vanishing in the mirror, and he wondered whether things might have been different if 5 years earlier, when the first complaint landed on his desk, he had chosen to protect a child instead of a system, but the question came too late, and he knew it. Pemberton Academy fell into chaos. 40 families withdrew their children in the first week. Parents crowded the offices demanding answers. The school board held 3 emergency meetings in 5 days, and an online petition calling for the permanent revocation of Janet Crawford's teaching license reached 25,000 signatures in 10 hours. Still climbing by the minute, and some wealthy parents who had stayed silent because their own children were unaffected now shouted the loudest out of fear of association. We did not know becoming the refrain, though the truth was they did not want to know, because knowing required action, and action meant confronting a system their children benefited from. And now that the system had collapsed, they rushed to the right side of history, as if they had always stood there. Crawford sat at home with the curtains drawn, her phone turned off because it would not stop vibrating. Dennis upstairs for 4 days without coming down to dinner. Whiskers curled beside her on the sofa, and Crawford sat in the dark listening to the neighbor's television broadcasting her name, listening to her life narrated by strangers with voices of rage and disgust, thinking that maybe this was the bottom, Maybe it could not get worse. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She almost did not open it after so many hateful texts that week, but she did. And on the screen was only an address, a time, and a single line. 1247 Industrial Boulevard, Warehouse 6, 8, tonight. This is the only invitation you will receive. Come alone. Crawford stared at the message for a long time in the dark, the phone's glow carving deep shadows under her eyes and along her nose, and she knew this was not a random threat. This was an invitation from the person who placed the jacket on her bed, moved her car, sent the email bomb that destroyed her life, the one who had turned the past 2 weeks into a nightmare without an exit. And when Dennis told her not to go, to call the police, that it was a threat, Crawford knew the police had been useless for 2 weeks, reports filed and disappearing into nothing, evidence going nowhere, officers passing files like a ball no one wanted to hold, and she began to suspect someone was slowing the system down, someone powerful enough to make the police look the other way, and if that was true, then calling them was calling into a void. She had to go. She needed to see the face of the person who had ruined her life, to know who and why, or to end the nightmare by any means, because sitting in the dark, holding a cat waiting for the next blow was not living. It was dying slowly. And Janet Crawford might be many things, but she was not someone who died slowly. So she stood, put on her coat, took her car keys, and stepped into the November night toward the industrial district on the east side of the city, where Warehouse 6 on Industrial Boulevard waited, unaware that tonight would change everything, not through violence or threats or destruction, but through something Janet Crawford at 48 had never prepared to face. Forgiveness from the child she had hurt most. Warehouse number 6 on Industrial Boulevard sat at the end of an unlit road in the Eastern Industrial District, a place where trucks came and went during the day, but where at night there was only darkness and wind threading through rusted steel frames. Crawford parked her car 50 meters away because her hands were shaking so badly she had to try 3 times before she got the gear into park. She sat there staring at the large steel door of the warehouse hanging slightly open, a weak yellow light spilling out, and she stayed in the car for 7 full minutes, fighting between a survival instinct, screaming for her to turn around and drive home, and something deeper than instinct, something she would later call the exhaustion of someone backed against a wall, telling her that if she did not walk through that door, she would never escape this nightmare, that she would spend the rest of her life curled in the dark, holding her cat, waiting for the next jacket on her pillow, the next car moved, the next silent call at 2 o'clock in the morning. And Crawford stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady on concrete, still wet from last night's rain. She walked toward the half-open door, pushed it wider, and went inside. The warehouse was vast and empty, the ceiling rising more than 10 meters. Gray brick walls, smooth concrete floor, and at the exact center, a single hanging bulb suspended from a long wire cast a circular pool of light about 3 meters across, like a stage, surrounded by darkness. And within that light stood a small wooden table, on it 2 pieces of a denim jacket laid side by side, and behind the table, standing at the boundary between light and shadow, was a man in a gray suit, dark hair, motionless, his hands folded in front of him, his face half lit and half in darkness. And Crawford knew at once this was not the kind of man she had ever met at a parent meeting. Not a polite businessman, not a forceful lawyer. This man stood in a dark warehouse with the bearing of someone who owned not just the building, but the streets around it. And the look he gave her as she entered was not anger or contempt. It was something worse than both combined. The cold assessment of someone deciding her fate before announcing the result. "I am Piper's father." His voice carried through the empty warehouse, not loud and not needing to be, the sound echoing off brick and steel so each word felt spoken twice, and Crawford stood frozen about 5 meters from the table, unable to take another step as her mind raced, because for 2 weeks she had wondered who stood behind everything that had happened to her, who could enter her house without leaving a trace, who had the resources to breach the school system, plant someone inside, send an email blast to 4 television stations at once, who had the power to make the police look away. And now the answer stood in front of her in a gray suit, and Crawford understood instantly that she had been wrong. Completely wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Piper Blackwell was not a poor child. The $3 jacket was not a sign of a family without money. It was the sign of something Crawford had never imagined, and she had misread everything from the beginning. 14 years of judging people by appearances, and she had never been so wrong as this time. Kieran stepped out of the shadows into the light, his face fully revealed beneath the bulb, and he looked down at the 2 pieces of the jacket on the table, his fingers brushing the cut where Crawford's scissors had torn it in 2, touching the blue thread Elise had sewn under a streetlight inside a Honda Civic during a Tennessee winter, touching the patch cut from torn jeans. And he said, "You saw this jacket and thought it was trash. You said it smelled like the slums. You threw it into the garbage in front of 30 children." His voice still calm, but each word heavier than the last. "You looked at this jacket and saw a $3 piece of trash, but you failed to see the years of survival woven into these seams. This wasn't just fabric to my wife. It was the only thing keeping her newborn warm when they had no roof but a rusted car and no hope but each other. Every mismatched stitch you see was a mother's promise to never let go. You didn't just cut a garment, Janet, you tried to sever the memory of their survival, and that is a debt you can never repay. You cut it in half in 3 seconds. Crawford wanted to speak, but no words came because she was looking into Kieran's eyes and seeing something she had never seen in any parent in 14 years. Not the anger of someone insulted, this was the fury of a protector, the primal rage of an animal whose young had been attacked, and it was more terrifying than anything Crawford had ever faced. "And you did not only do this to my daughter," Kieran continued, his voice slower now. 9 families, 5 years. Miguel Torres, 9 years old, forced to sit alone in a corner for 3 months because of worn clothes. Sue Yun Park given a failing grade with a red note shaming her family. Mr. Okafor called an outsider at a parent meeting. And you called that standards. You called it discipline. You called it protecting the school's image. And Kieran paused, drawing a breath, his eyes never leaving Crawford's. "No, that was not standards. That was cowardice. You chose children whose families you knew could not afford lawyers, had no power, no voice loud enough to be heard. You bullied the weak because you did not dare touch the strong, and that is the definition of cowardice." Crawford stumbled back 1 step without meaning to, her body retreating on instinct as it registered the danger in every word Kieran spoke. And Kieran moved forward, the distance between them, now only 2 meters, the calm mask he had held for 2 weeks beginning to crack beneath the bulb, and behind it was what Finn, Reed, Jace, the entire Blackwell empire feared, the true anger of Kieran Blackwell, not the kind that flares and dies, but the kind that has smoldered under ice and now breaks through it. My daughter cried in her mother's arms and asked why her teacher hated her. Kieran's voice was no longer calm. It shook with fury as he stood before the woman who made Piper ask if their home was a slum, and his entire body wanted to do what the underworld had taught him to do when someone touched his family. My daughter did not cry when you slapped her. Do you know why? Because she learned not to cry at 5 years old. Because life taught her that crying does not help, and you proved life right. And Kieran stepped closer still, now less than a meter away, close enough for Crawford to smell the expensive cologne on his suit, close enough to see the vein pulsing at his temple, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him like an overworked engine. Do you know how people pay in my world when they touch family? It was not a question, but a declaration. And Crawford looked into Kieran Blackwell's eyes then, looked into the depths of the man standing before her in a dark warehouse, in an empty industrial district at 8 o'clock at night. And she saw death. Not metaphorical, and not exaggerated. She saw that this man could kill her here and now, and no one would ever find her. No one would ever know. And he was weighing that choice. She saw the calculation pass through his eyes like a cloud crossing the sun, and the air thickened until Crawford forgot to breathe. Time froze. The lone bulb swayed slightly in a draft, casting moving shadows on the brick walls like ghosts watching, and Crawford thought this was how she would die, alone in a dark warehouse. No one knowing she was here, just like the children she had isolated in classrooms. Alone, unheard, nowhere to run. Then footsteps sounded behind Crawford. Not the heavy steps of a man, not Finn's or Reed's or Jace's, but 2 sets of steps, one light and one lighter still, one belonging to an adult and one to a child. And Crawford turned as Kieran lifted his head over her shoulder. And from the darkness near the warehouse door, 2 figures stepped into the light. Elise Dawson and Piper Blackwell, mother and daughter, hand in hand, and Piper looked straight at her father, with the eyes of a 10-year-old, who had lived far beyond her years, and said 3 words in a voice so gentle, yet so steady, that it stopped everything happening in the warehouse, as if someone had pressed pause in the middle of a storm. "Dad, stop." Kieran froze, the fist clenched and trembling at his side, slowly loosening, not because he wanted it to, but because his daughter's voice carried a power. No empire, no weapon, No threat could match. The power of a child he loved more than his own life, telling him to stop. And he stopped, because if Piper told him to stop, then he stopped. It was that simple. It was the promise he had made her on the first night in the bar staff room. A promise made in good faith. And good faith meant listening when his daughter needed him to listen. Piper released her mother's hand and stepped forward, past Crawford, who stood shaking in the middle of the warehouse, toward her father, placing her small hand on Kieran's arm and saying, "This is my thing, Dad. Let me speak." And Kieran looked down at his daughter, at the bruise on her cheek, now fading into yellow and green, but still there. And he wanted to refuse, wanted to say that Dad would handle it, that she did not need to face the person who had hurt her. But Piper's eyes told him what he had known for a long time and had not wanted to admit, that she was not a child who needed to be shielded from everything. She was a child who had protected herself since the age of 5 and now needed to close this chapter herself, in her own way, not in her father's. And Kieran stepped back one step, only one. But it was the hardest step of his life, harder than any decision he had made in 20 years of building an empire. Elise stepped forward and stood in the center of the warehouse facing Crawford, and the two women looked at each other for the first time since the parent meeting where Crawford had looked Elise up and down and whispered, "Scholarship kid." But this time, Elise did not lower her head or look away. She met Crawford's eyes with the gaze of a woman who had lived in a car through 4 winter months, who had worked 3 jobs while sleeping 3 hours a night, who had sewn a jacket under a streetlight with bleeding fingers. And her voice was calm, not raised and not shaking. Calm in the way only someone who has survived everything can be calm. "You looked at my daughter and judged her by the jacket she wore. You looked at me at that parent meeting and decided I was unworthy. You made my child ashamed of her roots, of her mother who once waited tables, of a family that was not born at the top, and you thought you were teaching her a lesson about her place. But what you were really teaching 30 children was that violence against the weaker is allowed, that judging others by appearances is normal." Elise paused, looked at the 2 pieces of the jacket on the table, and her voice shifted. Softer but sharper. "You do not need anyone to destroy you. You destroyed yourself long ago. From the first complaint you ignored, from the first child you forced to sit alone in a corner, you destroyed yourself every day for 5 years. You are only seeing it now." Then Piper stepped forward and stood between her mother and Crawford, a 10-year-old standing between 2 adults in a dark warehouse beneath a swaying bulb. And Crawford looked down at the child, at the face she had slapped 2 weeks earlier, at the bruise still healing on her left cheek, at the dark round eyes she had regarded with contempt all year. And Piper looked up at Crawford without anger or fear or contempt. She simply looked and said, "Miss Crawford, the night you cut my jacket, I went home and cried in my mom's arms. I asked her why you hated me. I asked if our home was a slum. I am only 10 years old, Miss Crawford. I am only 10. Crawford met the child's gaze, and for the first time, not through video, not through reports, not through anyone else's words, she saw the consequence of her actions, not the consequence on paper or in court, but the consequence on the face of a 10-year-old who had cried and asked her mother if their home was a slum because a 48-year-old adult decided that a jacket hand stitched in a car during winter was trash. Piper continued, her voice still steady and calm, but her eyes beginning to glisten, and it was the first time that night she allowed herself to be weak, just a little, just enough for Crawford to see that beneath the armor life had forced her to wear was still a child, still a 10-year-old. "I forgive you, Miss Crawford," and the warehouse was so silent that the faint hum of the bulb could be heard. "I forgive you not because you deserve it, not because what you did not hurt. It hurt. It still hurts. But I forgive you because I deserve peace. I do not want to carry this anger with me. I do not want to grow up and think of you every time I see the jacket. I want to remember my mom sitting in the car, sewing it under a streetlight, even when her fingers were bleeding. I want to remember her singing to me while her teeth chattered from the cold. I want to remember the jacket through my mom's love, not through your scissors." Crawford collapsed, her knees hitting the cold concrete as she fell to the floor of the warehouse. And for the first time, not out of fear or desperation or loss of job or reputation, she cried because she saw, truly saw, the 10-year-old standing before her, offering forgiveness with a maturity she herself did not have at 48. The child she had deemed unworthy giving her what no one else had given her in 2 weeks, not pity and not protection, but true forgiveness, the kind that asks nothing in return and simply lets go. And Crawford wept on the warehouse floor. Her hands braced against the ground, tears darkening the concrete beneath her. Behind Piper, Kieran Blackwell stood motionless, his eyes red, no longer from anger but from something stronger. He watched his 10-year-old daughter stand in that warehouse, forgiving the woman who had slapped her and cut the most sacred object in their family with a steady voice and wet eyes. And he understood then that Piper Blackwell was stronger than he was. Strong in a way he, a man who knew how to destroy, would never be. Because Kieran knew destruction, but Piper knew release. And release was 1,000 times harder. Elise stepped to her husband's side, her hand resting lightly against the back of his, not gripping, just touching. And Kieran felt the warmth of her fingers like a tether pulling him back from the edge he had nearly crossed. Because if Piper had not entered that warehouse, he did not know what he would have done, and he did not want to think about it. He only knew that his daughter had saved not Crawford, but him, saved him from becoming something he never wanted Piper to see. Piper turned back to her parents, took one of Kieran's hands and one of Elise's, and said in the gentle, clear voice of a child who had lived beyond her years, but was still a child who needed to go home after a long day, "Let's go home, Dad." And the three of them walked out of the warehouse into the November night, leaving behind Janet Crawford kneeling alone on the cold concrete beneath the swaying bulb. Alone. But this time that aloneness was different. Not the isolation of punishment, but the solitude of someone who had just been given a chance. She did not yet know if she deserved the chance to look back, truly look back, and decide whether the woman in that video would be who she remained forever, or whether she could still become someone else. The hearing took place on Tuesday of the 4th week, in a small conference room at the district office. 4 members of the disciplinary board, seated behind a long table, before them, the 200-page file that had by now become the most infamous set of documents in the city's educational history. Harrison sat beside Crawford but barely spoke, because there was nothing to say. The video was clear. The internal emails were clear. The 9 dismissed complaints were clear. The deliberate shutdown of the camera was clear. And 7 families were prepared to testify. The hearing lasted 47 minutes, shorter than a single class period Crawford had once taught, and the outcome was the permanent revocation of Janet Louise Crawford's teaching license. 14 years in the classroom, ending in 47 minutes, Crawford signed the record with a hand that did not shake, because she had no tears left to cry, and no strength left to tremble. She set the pen down, stood, and walked out of the room without looking back, passing the hallway where 3 reporters waited. But she did not look at them, did not cover her face, did not run. She simply walked. Steady steps, eyes forward, because after the night in the warehouse, she understood that running was pointless when the thing she had to face was not cameras or journalists, but herself. Dennis filed for divorce the following week, quietly, without shouting or arguments. He left the papers on the kitchen table one morning, while Crawford sat drinking coffee, then sat across from her and said in a sad but resolute voice that he had tried. He had tried to see her as the woman he married 23 years ago, but every time he looked at her, he saw the woman in that video, and he could not live with that woman anymore. He was sorry, and Crawford signed the divorce papers with the same pen she had used to sign the license revocation. 2 signatures in 2 weeks, erasing the 2 things she had built her entire life around, her career and her marriage. Dennis moved out one afternoon, taking his clothes and books, leaving the shared furniture, leaving the house, leaving Whiskers because he knew Crawford needed the cat more than he did. And when the sound of his car faded down the street, Crawford sat on the living room floor. Whiskers jumped into her lap, and she held the cat without crying because she was empty. Crawford listed the house for sale 3 weeks later because she could no longer afford the mortgage without a salary. The house she and Dennis had bought 15 years earlier with the dream of children running in the yard, a dream they never realized, a dream Crawford had replaced with something else: power in the classroom, control over 30 children each day, the feeling of speaking and being obeyed. And now she understood that this might be exactly why she had become the woman in the video, because she had turned the classroom into her own small kingdom, and poor children into intruders within it. In the final week before handing over the house, Crawford went to the grocery store to buy food for Whiskers, and in aisle 7, a young woman recognized her. Not from the school, but from the video with 2 million views. The woman looked at Crawford with an expression Crawford had seen too many times in the past month, disgust mixed with contempt, then pulled her small child away as if Crawford were contagious. And Crawford stood there in the aisle holding a box of cat food, watching the woman drag her child away. And she felt it exactly, the sensation of being judged not as a person, but as a single moment, of being evaluated without explanation, condemned without appeal, and she stood there a long time between the pet food shelves and realized that this was exactly what she had done to 9 children over 5 years. She had looked at them through the clothes they wore, the jobs their parents worked, the neighborhoods they lived in, and judged them without ever caring to know who they were. And now that she herself was being judged by a 4-minute video, no one cared about who she had been before or after that moment. She finally understood, not intellectually but physically, with a numbness spreading through her body in the middle of a grocery aisle, how much judgment hurts, how much it hurts to be stripped of the right to be seen as a whole human being. Crawford moved to another city 3 weeks later, a small town in another state where no one recognized her face. She rented the cheapest room she could find, and brought only whiskers and 2 suitcases of clothes. She began working as a data entry clerk, at minimum wage, 8 hours a day. She typed numbers from one table to another. It was monotonous, mind-numbing work, but Crawford did not complain. She went to work every day and came home every night. She cooked for herself and for Whiskers, sat alone on the sofa in the small rented room, and thought constantly, about Miguel Torres sitting alone in the corner of a classroom for 3 months, about Soo-Yun Park and the red ink on her math test, about Mr. Okafor being called an outsider, about Piper standing in a warehouse saying she was only 10 years old, and every night those memories pierced her chest like needles. But Crawford did not try to forget them. She kept them, carried them with her, letting them remind her every day of who she had been and who she must never become again. And months later, when a coworker asked whether she regretted her past, Crawford said that guilt was a compass. If you could feel it, then at least you knew where you were and which direction you needed to go. While Crawford rebuilt her life from the ashes in another city, Pemberton Academy underwent the most extensive reform in its 40-year history. A new school board appointed a new principal, Patricia Alvarez, the first Mexican-American woman to hold the position. She established an anonymous hotline for students and parents to report abuse, installed a new camera system that no teacher could disable, mandated anti-discrimination and equity training for all faculty, and a new policy informally known as Piper's Law was implemented. Though Piper had never asked for it, the policy stipulated that no teacher could confiscate a student's personal belongings, no teacher could comment on a student's family background, and all complaints must be reviewed by an independent committee rather than the principal. 25,000 signatures on an online petition became real changes on paper, and Piper Blackwell's story became a case study taught in teacher training programs across the district. The 7 victim families received compensation from Pemberton Academy through an out-of-court settlement, each family receiving enough to cover therapy for their children and transfer tuition. But what those families did not know was that Pemberton Academy did not have sufficient funds for those payments. Most of the money came from an anonymous donor, whose identity the board never disclosed. Kieran Blackwell never spoke of it. Not to Elise, not to Piper, not to anyone, because he did not do it to be thanked. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to stand at 15 years old in the rain, at a cemetery with no one helping, and if he could ensure that 7 children would not carry wounds with no one to heal them, then that was enough. Miguel Torres returned to a new school with psychological support, and after 6 months, began sitting in the middle of the classroom, instead of choosing the back corner. Soo-Yun Park re-enrolled in advanced mathematics, and earned an A on her final exam. The Okafor family did not return, but their son received a full scholarship at a better school, and each of the 9 wounds began to heal, slowly, imperfectly, with scars still visible, but healing nonetheless. That night, after Piper had fallen asleep, and the penthouse sank into silence, Elise sat at the kitchen table under the warm yellow light. Before her, the 2 pieces of the $3 denim jacket from Goodwill, the jacket that had survived 4 winter months in a car, that had been wrapped around Piper every night when the 2 of them only had each other, that Kieran had secretly waterproofed because he understood it was the most valuable thing in their home, and that Janet Crawford had cut into 2 pieces with a single pair of scissors in front of 30 children. Elise placed the 2 pieces of fabric side by side, aligning the cut down to the millimeter, then took out a needle and thread, not the blue thread she had used the first time she stitched the jacket in the car under a streetlight 10 years earlier. This time she chose white thread, pure white, bright against the faded blue denim, and she began to sew, each stitch slow and steady, piercing through the thick layers of fabric, her fingers no longer cracked like they were 10 years ago, no longer bleeding from needle pricks, but each stitch still carried the same love, the same promise, the same meaning, and when she finished, the white thread ran straight down the jacket like a scar, unhidden, uncamouflaged, standing out clearly against the denim. And Elise looked at that line for a long time and smiled because she understood that the jacket was like her family. It had been torn, but it had been stitched back together, and a scar was not something to be ashamed of. A scar was proof that it had survived. The next morning, Piper woke up and saw the denim jacket hanging on the hook by her bedroom door, whole again, rejoined, with the white seam running down the middle glowing in the early sunlight streaming through the window, and she stood there for a long time, her fingers tracing the white stitches from top to bottom, feeling each even stitch beneath her fingertips. Then she smiled, the smile of a 10-year-old who had once cried in her mother's arms, asking whether their home was a slum, but who had now found her own answer. And she put the jacket on, stood in front of the mirror, looked at the white seam running down the center of her chest, like a decorative stripe, like a medal, like a warrior's scar, and she said to her mother standing in the doorway that it was more beautiful than before. And Elise nodded because she knew her daughter was not talking about the jacket. Piper transferred to a new school, a good public school near their home that Kieran and Elise chose together because they wanted Piper to grow up among ordinary children rather than behind $35,000 walls, and Piper wore the denim jacket with the white seam to school every day. She made the honor roll her first semester, joined the debate team, and won the city competition with a speech about children's rights in schools, earning a perfect score for content because Piper did not speak in theory. She spoke from experience, and the white seam on her jacket shone under the stage lights, like a silent reminder to everyone in the audience of what the child standing before them had been through. One evening, Piper sat beside her mother on the sofa, her hand still unconsciously rubbing the corner of the jacket the way she had done since she was little, and she asked why they kept the jacket when they had money for new clothes now. And Elise looked at her daughter, looked into the bright dark eyes she had first seen in the delivery room of the Shelby County Public Hospital 10 years earlier, when she was 21, alone, broke, homeless, with no one. And she said that the jacket reminded her daughter that she had been strong before there was a rich father, before there was a penthouse, before there was a closet full of new clothes, that she had been strong when she lay wrapped in that jacket during winter in a car, and that no one and nothing could ever take that strength away from her. That night, Kieran and Elise stood side by side at the penthouse window overlooking the city spread below, millions of lights flickering like falling stars, and Elise rested her head against her husband's shoulder and whispered that he had almost lost himself in the warehouse that night. And Kieran was silent for a long time before saying that he knew. Then he added in a softer voice than usual, the voice of the South Boston orphan boy, rather than the Empire boss, that Piper had taught him that real strength was not the ability to destroy an enemy. Real strength was choosing not to become one, and that his 10-year-old daughter understood that while he was 35, and still learning. On Monday morning at her new school, Piper walked into class, wearing the faded blue denim jacket with its bright white seam. A girl at the desk next to her looked at the jacket, tilted her head, smiled, and asked where she bought it, and Piper looked down at the jacket, at the white seam, at the patch cut from her mother's torn jeans, at the button sewn with mismatched blue thread. Then she smiled, a wide, warm, genuine smile, the smile of a child who had cried and healed, fallen and risen, been slapped and chosen forgiveness, and she said that her mother gave it to her, no brand, but the most expensive thing she owned, and the morning sunlight streamed through the classroom window onto the white seam of the $3 denim jacket, that seam sparkling brighter than any designer logo, brighter than any luxury item in any wealthy child's closet. Because it did not carry a fashion brand, it carried the brand of love, survival. 4 winter months in a car, a mother sewing by streetlight with bleeding fingers, a father kneeling in a bar's staff room and promising he meant well, a 10-year-old child standing in a dark warehouse choosing forgiveness over hatred. That white seam was a scar, and a scar was the most beautiful proof that you had survived. This story is not just about a jacket or a teacher or a mafia boss. It is about human worth not being measured by clothing labels or bank balances. It reminds us never to judge anyone by appearances, because you do not know what they have walked through to stand where they are. It reminds us that real strength does not lie in power or money, but in the ability to forgive and let go. And it reminds us that a parent's love, whether shown through a $3 jacket or a billion-dollar empire, weighs the same on the scale of life. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something when Piper stood in the warehouse and said she was only 10 years old, If you shed a tear when Elise stitched the jacket with white thread late at night, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so more people can hear this story, because every share spreads the message of compassion and forgiveness a little further in this world. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Piper's choice to forgive? Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Do you have a jacket that carries memories nothing can replace? Share your story in the comments below. We read every comment and listen to every story from the depths of your hearts, because that is what drives us to keep bringing you emotional videos every day. We wish all of you watching good health, joyful lives, peace in each day, and remember that you deserve love, no matter what you are wearing. Goodbye and see you in the next video.